All right, ready to dig into the Pragmatic Programmer with me? This book by Andrew Hunt and David Thomas, it's like legendary in the software world, and for good reason, right?
Yeah.
It's packed with advice that stood the test of time.
Oh, absolutely. It's like having those seasoned mentors, the ones with all the stories, giving you the inside scoop on building better software.
Totally. And the way they kick things off,
Mm-hmm.
comparing coding to a craft, genius, right?
Uh-huh.
It's not just churning out lines of code. It's about approaching it with, like, care, even a touch of artistry. You're not just building a program, you're crafting something people will actually use.
Yeah.
Has that kind of mindset shift helped you in your work?
100%. It's so easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day, the deadlines, the bugs. But when you see it as a craft, it elevates everything. You start thinking about elegance, maintainability, like how will this code hold up in the long run?
It's that difference between a microwave dinner and, actually savoring the process of cooking something delicious. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And one of the key ingredients in that recipe for crafting great software, Hunt and Thomas call it pragmatic paranoia.
Okay, pragmatic paranoia. Sounds a little intimidating. Should I be worried?
Not at all. It's about being real, being pragmatic. It means accepting that perfect software. It's a myth. We all make mistakes, and those mistakes, they're going to show up in our code.
So it's not about chasing this impossible dream of perfect code.
Exactly. It's more about building software that's ready for those errors because they will happen. It's about designing for resilience.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like when you're building a bridge, you're not just assuming it'll never see strong winds or heavy traffic. You design it to withstand those things.
Exactly. And the book has this great analogy talking about broken windows. The idea that if you leave one broken window unfixed, it kind of invites more neglect and things start to fall apart.
Oh, yeah. It's like that one messy corner in your house. Soon enough, the whole place is a disaster.
Right. And it's the same with code. One small issue, if you ignore it, it can grow, attract bigger problems. It's like this downward spiral of code quality.
Ouch. Yeah. Been there, done that. Guilty of letting a few broken windows slide in my code before. But thinking about it that way makes you realize how important those small fixes are before they turn into a huge mess.
Absolutely. Early vigilance pays off big time.
And speaking of catching things early,
Mhm.
the book is really big on testing. And not just any testing, they talk about design by contract, which honestly sounds kind of formal. What's that all about?
It's like setting clear expectations from the get-go. Think of it like a contract, but for your code. With design by contract, you're defining exactly what each piece of code expects as input, what it promises to deliver as output, and any conditions that need to hold true throughout.
So less about hoping for the best and more about setting clear boundaries and expectations for your code to follow.
Precisely. You're forced to think through potential problems, edge cases, how different parts of your code should play together.
So imagine if you could create these clear expectations for your code, almost like a legal agreement that's designed by contract, and it can save you from headaches down the road. Think about a time you ran into a bug because, a function wasn't used the way it was intended. DDC helps prevent those situations.
100%. It's like having a built-in safety net that catches those errors early on. And you know what else is great for catching errors? The book talks about this really cool technique. They call it rubber duck debugging.
Okay, I have to hear about this. Rubber duck debugging. What is that?
You ever get so stuck on a bug that you just need to talk it out?
Oh, all the time. Like I need to explain it to someone else, even if that someone is like, my cat.
You're not alone. That's basically the idea behind rubber duck debugging. Explain your code line by line to anything that will listen. It could be a rubber duck, a plant, a picture on your desk.
Wait, so I haven't been wasting my breath talking to my houseplants all these years.
Not at all. You see, often just explaining your code out loud, even if it's to something that doesn't understand, it helps you hear the flaw in your logic. It forces you to slow down, articulate each step, and often you'll catch those hidden assumptions that might be tripping you up.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's like giving your brain a forced walkthrough to help catch those sneaky errors.
Exactly. Speaking of keeping things clean and easy to understand, the book dives into this concept called orthogonality.
Orthogonality. Okay, that sounds a little intimidating. Is that like advanced geometry but for code?
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Imagine you're flying a helicopter, right?
Hmm.
Each control has a specific isolated effect. Pull up on the collective, you go up. Push forward on the cyclic, you go forward.
Okay, I'm following you.
The key is everything's independent. And that's what we want in our code. Modules that are decoupled, self-contained. So if you make a change in one area, it doesn't create this domino effect throughout your whole code base.
So instead of having this tangled mess where changing one line of code could break something completely unrelated.
Exactly. You want to contain the impact of those changes. With orthogonality, you're aiming for systems where you can tweak one component without worrying about the whole house of cards collapsing.
That makes sense. So it's like having those clear boundaries within your code base so that each module, each component knows its job and doesn't step on anyone else's toes. And this kind of ties into that DRY principle we talked about before, right? Don't repeat yourself.
Absolutely. Orthogonality and DRY, they go hand in hand. When you have orthogonal code, it's easier to spot and eliminate duplication, which makes your code base leaner, meaner, less prone to errors. And to really drive this point home, the book highlights this idea of embracing plain text for pretty much everything. From writing code to storing your knowledge, plain text is key.
I've heard a lot about the power of plain text, but I'll admit it's always seemed a bit, old school. Like, why not use the latest note-taking app or fancy documentation software?
Think of plain text as the universal language of programming. Simple, human-readable, and future-proof. No matter what new frameworks, what new languages come along, plain text will always be there. It's like the bedrock upon which you can build anything.
So it's not so much about the tool itself, but more about having a format that will stand the test of time no matter what.
Exactly. Plus, because it's so straightforward, it makes your code, your documentation, more accessible to others. You're not locking anyone out with proprietary formats or complex dependencies.
Right. It's the difference between writing a secret message in disappearing ink and putting up a billboard for everyone to see.
Exactly. And along those lines, the Pragmatic Programmer really pushes for embracing the Unix philosophy of small, sharp tools. Have you ever played around with using the command line or shell scripting?
I've dabbled a bit, but I'll admit, it always seemed a bit intimidating. Like something only, hardcore hackers in movies use.
There's definitely a learning curve, but the payoff,
Oh.
huge. The command line gives you so much control, so much flexibility. You can automate tasks, manipulate data, even build entire workflows using these simple commands. It's like having this secret weapon that unlocks a whole new level of efficiency.
So instead of clicking through a million menus or doing things manually, you can just whip up a quick script to automate the whole process.
Precisely. It's
Yeah.
about leveraging the power of automation to make your life easier and reduce the chance of errors.
Okay, you're making me want to dust off my terminal and give it another shot. What I find interesting is this whole idea of small, sharp tools. It seems to connect back to orthogonality, wouldn't you say?
It's all connected. The pragmatic programmer really emphasizes building systems from these smaller, loosely coupled components like Lego blocks that you can combine and recombine.
So instead of this giant monolithic program that's a nightmare to understand and change, you break it down into these smaller, more manageable pieces. And each piece can be built, tested independently, right?
You got it. And to help you create those well-defined, decoupled components, the book talks about the law of Demeter. Have you ever come across this principle before?
The law of Demeter, yeah, it rings a bell, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory.
So it's all about setting boundaries in your code. Imagine like those gossipy neighbors, right? The ones who just can't keep a secret. The law of Demeter is basically saying only talk to your immediate neighbors. In code, that means each module, each object, it should only interact directly with the things it absolutely needs to. Keep its knowledge limited.
So no spreading rumors throughout the code
Yeah.
base. Okay, but seriously, how does that actually work in practice?
Okay.
Why is limiting that interaction a good thing?
Think of it this way. Let's say you're fixing a leaky faucet, right? You don't need to understand the entire plumbing system of your house just to tighten a few screws, do you? It's the same idea with code. The law of Demeter helps you create these independent units of code. They're easier to understand, easier to test, easier to modify without having these unintended consequences rippling through your whole program.
Right, because if every single part of your code is like super tightly intertwined, making a change is like navigating a minefield. You never know what you might accidentally set off.
Exactly. The law of Demeter helps you avoid those coding catastrophes by encouraging you to create these well-defined interfaces between your modules.
It's the difference between trying to untangle a giant knot of Christmas lights and having them all neatly organized in those separate labeled boxes.
Love that analogy. It's about bringing order to the potential chaos of code. And this actually ties into another essential thing that Hunt and Thomas talk about, refactoring.
Refactoring. Okay, that always sounds kind of intense. So some major code overhaul.
It doesn't have to be as scary as it sounds. Think of refactoring like tending a garden. You're constantly weeding, pruning, rearranging things to keep everything healthy and growing, right? It's about making those small incremental improvements to your code's design, but without changing how it actually works, its functionality.
So it's less about like scrapping everything and starting over
Yeah.
and more about this continuous fine-tuning process.
Exactly. And remember that broken window analogy we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
It applies here too. Those little bits of messy code, those design flaws you notice, it's so much easier to address them early on while they're still manageable.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah. But how do you even know when it's time to refactor? Are there like telltale signs that your code needs a bit of, gardening?
Absolutely. One major red flag is duplicated code. If you're writing the same logic in multiple places, that's a good sign that you could benefit from refactoring that code into a reusable function or a module.
Right, because that violates the DRY principle, right? Don't
Uh-huh.
repeat yourself. It's like having like multiple copies of the same document floating around. It just creates confusion and makes it way harder to keep everything consistent.
Exactly. Another sign is when your code is just plain hard to understand. If you're squinting at your screen trying to decipher what a piece of code even does, it's probably a good candidate for refactoring. Remember, clear and readable code, it's a kindness to your future self and to any other developers who might work on that code base in the future.
Yeah, because wrestling with cryptic code is no one's idea of a good time. And, speaking of making life easier, the book also dives into the tricky world of estimating. I'll be honest, estimating how long a task will take is something I really struggle with. Any tips from the masters?
Estimating is one of those things that's definitely as much art as it is science, but the Pragmatic Programmer has some really solid advice. One key thing they recommend is breaking down large tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Okay, yeah.
It's a lot easier to wrap your head around a problem and come up with a more accurate estimate for each little piece.
Makes sense. It's less overwhelming to estimate the time for building a single room than to try to predict the whole construction timeline for a skyscraper.
Exactly. And speaking of building things, the book also dives deep into the importance of testing. And not just any testing, they're big proponents of what they call ruthless testing.
Ruthless testing. Okay, that sounds kind of intense. What's so ruthless about it?
It's about testing everything, testing often, and automating as much of that testing process as you can. Think of it like having this really, really rigorous quality control system in place so that you can catch defects super early on.
So instead of just doing like a quick spot check before you launch a product or something, it's more about like weaving testing into every single stage of the development process.
Exactly. And one of the main ways that they recommend building this ruthless testing culture is through automated testing. Have you ever worked with automated tests before?
I've dabbled a bit with unit testing, but I'm not sure I'd call myself a pro.
Well, unit testing is a fantastic starting point. It's all about breaking your code down into these small, testable units, and then you write automated tests to verify that each of those units behaves exactly as you expect it to. That way, you get instant feedback whenever you make changes, and you can catch bugs way before they have a chance to cause any real problems.
Yeah, it's like having a safety net to catch you before you fall instead of just trying to like patch you up after you've already hit the ground.
Precisely. And the pragmatic programmer, they even take it a step further. They encourage things like continuous integration, where your code is constantly being integrated and tested automatically. It's about building this culture of quality from the ground up.
It's like the difference between building a house on a shaky foundation and constructing it on solid bedrock, right?
Yeah.
And you know what I really like? It's how they tie all these technical practices back to this idea of craftsmanship. It's not just about churning out code. It's about taking pride in your work, building something that's truly well crafted and built to last.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of craftsmanship, one thing that really stuck with me was their warning about relying too heavily on what they call code wizards.
Code wizards. Okay, this I have to hear about. Are we talking about like actual wizards casting spells on our code?
Not quite. They're referring to those code generators, visual programming tools, all those magical solutions that promise to write code for you.
Oh, right. Like those drag and drop interface builders, the ones that
Yeah.
are supposed to make building a UI as easy as pie.
Exactly. And while those tools can definitely be helpful sometimes, the book warns against becoming overly reliant on them.
Because if you don't actually understand the code that those tools are generating, you're essentially giving up control over your own program, right?
Precisely. It's like, imagine relying on a GPS to navigate everywhere you go without ever bothering to actually learn the roads yourself. What happens if your GPS malfunctions or gives you bad
You're
directions?
completely stuck. It's like outsourcing your programming skills to a black box without really understanding what's happening inside.
Exactly. The pragmatic programmer is all about encouraging you to take ownership of your craft. Don't be afraid to dig into those details, understand how things work under the hood.
So it's about being an active participant in your craft, not just a passive consumer of all these fancy tools, right?
Yeah. Precisely.
Yeah.
And, as we've been talking about all these different practices, embracing pragmatic paranoia, ruthlessly testing our code, being wary of those code wizards, it strikes me that the pragmatic programmer is way more than just a technical manual. It's really a guide to cultivating a certain mindset, a way of approaching software development that goes way beyond just, banging out lines of code. It's more like it's giving you this framework for thinking about software development in a way that's adaptable, in a way that's going to serve you well no matter what challenges you encounter down the road.
It's like they're saying, here are the tools, here are the techniques, but most importantly, here's the mindset that you need to not just survive, but to really thrive in this ever-changing world of software.
I love that. And it's incredible how spot on those ideas still are, even all these years after the book first came out. A true classic, really.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been amazing. I
Hmm.
feel like I have a whole new understanding of what it means to be a pragmatic programmer. Is there like one big takeaway that really stuck with you?
For me, it always comes back to that metaphor at the beginning of the book, software development as a craft. That whole idea of approaching your work with care, with intentionality, always wanting to learn and grow.
Beautifully said. It's about embracing the journey of becoming a better programmer, line by line, module by module, feature by feature.
Exactly. I think we've definitely extracted some serious wisdom from the pragmatic programmer.
I couldn't agree more. Huge thank you to you for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.
Keep those programmer brains buzzing. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.